my wife and I had a different view of what a relationship was to look like to be successful. I had a real narcissistic view of a relationship, and that was if I had my needs met, whatever that box looked like, part of it which was real sexual, then I was going to be a really good husband. I simply just didn't know how to have an intimate relationship in a mature way. Kim and I were from two different types of family backgrounds. So ours wasn't very volatile. We covered up truths. And my wife had grown up in a relationship where her father was an angry man, yelled at him, screamed at him, and my wife's reaction to that was either she would withdraw or she would cry. So she cried often as a defense to an emotion that she couldn't handle. In the third way, she would lash back in anger. And so the first time that I ever saw or experienced her raising her voice or yelling at me, I withdrew, and I didn't know how to handle that. And so I would just withdraw from communication. I didn't know how to communicate through that. I saw that at that time as a whole lot more destructive than me withdrawing. Saw it more destructive, believe it or not, than me having a relationship outside of my marriage. So it was just kind of I was in a distorted place. If someone said to me back during this time, what's the most important thing, I wouldn't have hesitated to say it's my children. Certainly wasn't my family, wasn't my wife. We were at that point. We were such that I didn't even enjoy being in the same room with her. I didn't want to be with her. We couldn't. If I was out of town, we couldn't have a conversation on the telephone for 30 seconds without the conversation breaking down, us having some sort of words. But all the while, we'd go places and functions, and we'd look okay. And so I still had all this continuing strife of I wanted to be a family man, and I wanted to do the right thing, but I felt again like I couldn't keep it on the tracks, and I knew that our relationship was not good to the point where when my youngest son graduated from high school, I knew that I wanted to divorce her, but I didn't know if I'd have the guts to do it.
Well, that's certainly a powerful story, and apparently we're going to talk about some sheep this morning, but maybe more than just sheep. First things first, though, my name is Adam Dressler. Some of you might know me. It's been a joy to come back here over the years and be a part of your faith community here. Some of you who don't, that's okay. I'm not that important anyway. But I do want to tell you about someone who is really important because our family has changed since I've last been here. We have a picture we're going to put up on the screen. Yes. That's what guest speakers do to get sympathy first. So you invite us back. That is our new daughter, Ainsley. We have a daughter named Addison, who's 5. We have a son named Aaron, who's 2.5, and then Ainsley is 11 weeks today, and she is a joy of our life. She also takes a lot of our money and sleep, but apart from that, we are so grateful for her, and my wife and 3 kids are back at home, hopefully surviving while I'm here. So I come on behalf of that. One of the things that's been neat about having this third kid, and you can go ahead and take that picture down if that's okay, so people can zero in on what's less important right now. It's really pretty fun because, and I don't know if you guys have kids, but one of the things that's always amazing is when you go to the hospital and your wife does the most amazing thing ever, and that she brings life into the world, and you are sending out text messages giving the updates. After that, the doctors and the nurses come in and they bring you this packet of information, and you just start to fill out this paperwork, and you get to choose the name of this other human being, and you get to apply for a social security card, and you get to say that you're going to be responsible for this person. And then after about a day or 2 or 3 or 4, however long you're in the hospital, they just give you this kid. And there's no list of, okay, now make sure you do this or make sure you do that. All they do is just make sure, do you have a car seat? Okay, you must be a competent parent. And then they send you off with this other life. And I had forgotten about that. Well, when our daughter was born, all that kind of came in new, fresh ways. And I realized that not just of my oldest daughter and my son, but now this new little girl, Ainsley, I'm responsible for her. Right? I'm responsible for her morally. I'm responsible for her in terms of just providing for her. And in fact, I'm so responsible for her that if I stop being responsible for her, people will now come and be responsible for me and put me somewhere else, right? I'm responsible for this little life. And with that responsibility comes this great opportunity to influence her. And I already see that now, that she is a Dressler through and through. And some of that is because she was born with our DNA, but also because she's growing up in our home. And even at 11 weeks, she already looks and acts and responds like her mom and I. And so we are influencing this person that we are responsible for. And that's the way that God designed it. God designed us to influence one another and to be a part of each other's lives. And we see this all the way back in one of the earliest stories of all humanity and one of the most famous stories in Genesis. Where, if you're not familiar with that story, that God creates a man named Adam and then He creates a woman named Eve. And things seem to be seemingly well in the very beginning. And yet, from the very beginning of Genesis chapter 3, we see that now there's going to be some tension here. And what was first formed to be a relationship that was supposed to mutually complement one another, we see that Eve exercises tremendous influence over Adam and says what? Please come and eat this delicious fruit with me. Right? Adam doesn't get that idea on his own, so husbands everywhere, you can just claim that. When someone's upset with you, hey, it was my wife's fault. So Adam and Eve are in relationship with one another, and Eve influences Adam to come and participate in taking of this fruit. And what God is doing very early on in the Scriptures is He's showing us that human beings were connected in a very intimate way. And that connection extends into influence and being able to influence one another. And fast forward a couple thousand years, and what it looks like to me and my wife right now is sometimes when we have a free moment, we'll find ourselves watching TV and we'll just kind of click through like zombies, and then eventually we'll settle on something. And because my wife has given birth to 3 other human beings, I let her choose what we watch. All right? That's not my say anymore. And so she will eventually land on something like Say Yes to the Dress. How many of you guys know what Say Yes to the Dress is? Yeah. No shame in that. Yeah, Say Yes to the Dress. And so what that is if you're not familiar with that, is it's a bunch of people that get really dramatic about wedding dresses. And so these women will be looking at that, and everyone has an opinion and all that kind of stuff. And so it's this half-hour show where it creates drama, and then it resolves where someone says yes to the dress and buys it, right? Well, something really strange has started to happen to me in the past few months. When my wife's not home, or maybe she's doing laundry, or maybe she's hanging out, I'll be flipping through, and I will find myself stopping on Say Yes to the Dress. Right? Now, I don't know why. I have no answer. I can't even explain it, but it takes just a few minutes, and then I'm committed. I'm in. And I'm saying, wow, is it going to be the sequins? Is it going to be what is it? You know? That mom just needs to mind her business. It's her daughter's day. I'm thinking all of these things. Right? Honestly, sometimes my wife is not even in the house and I'm doing this. Because God has designed relationships to lead to influence. Right? So it's not just that, and we see that all over the place. How many of you guys remember what it was like to be in junior high or high school, and just what a test of endurance those years are? Basically, it's just, can you make it through these 7 years of insecurity? Because your peer groups have such an incredible influence on you as well. I remember in my day, it was, which seems weird to say, I know I look young, but I'm actually going to turn 35, so I think that qualifies me as being able to have a day. When I remember in my day, I don't know. You can tell me afterwards. In my day, shoes were a really big deal. And so I was not a very good basketball player, but I thought that if I could get somehow a pair of Nike Air Jordans, then I would become a good basketball player. And so I saw all of my peers wearing those shoes, and I just wanted to be accepted like them. I found myself saying things like they would say, watching things that they would watch, whether I liked them or not, because influence deeply matters. Whenever we are in a relationship with someone else, there's an exchange of influence going on all the time, right? And marketers know that. as well. That's why they can sell you certain things that you're not even sure you want or even find a need for, and yet because someone that you esteem or someone that you think looks pretty or looks cool or someone you want to be like uses a certain product or endorses a certain product, you will now want that same product as well. It's very similar to what a wise man who wrote hundreds of years ago once said, John Donne, the poet. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. No man is an island. We are all connected. Everyone is connected to this continent. There's a main that's on this. And God has put every single one of us in relationship with others. And because of this connected relationship now, there's an exchange of influence. And sometimes this influence turns into authority. Right? Sometimes this influence gets leveraged in a way and gets created in a way that it actually turns into authority. Maybe this is a manager and employee. Maybe this is a parent and a child. Maybe this is a coach and a team. Maybe this is a teacher in a classroom. Maybe this is the leader of a volunteer organization or a team. And whatever that is, sometimes when your influence gets elevated to the place where you are responsible in a different way over some things than others. And you may even carry a different level of responsibility than some other people. That level of responsibility is an authority. Now, how do we use our authority well? For those of us that are in relationships that have led to authority, and that may be a parent, like I said, that may be even a spouse. There's certain levels of authority that happen within a marriage. That may be anything. How do we use that authority well? Well, there's lots of really wise ways that we can look at that. And yet one of the ways I want to look at that this morning is a passage from the Bible. And it's John chapter 10. We'll have it up on the screen, but Jesus gives us these words in John 10, verse 1. He says this, Most assuredly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice. And he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow them, for they know his voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. Now Jesus used this illustration, but they did not understand the things which he spoke to him. Maybe we don't understand the things which he spoke either. So I want to explain a couple things about what Jesus is saying. He gives this illustration of sheep. And he says something about sheep is really important that he wanted his followers to hear. And he wasn't just speaking to his followers, he was actually speaking to a group called the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were kind of the religious leaders of the day, and they were somewhat elite. And so as they were sent to investigate the teachings in the life of Jesus, they were always trying to catch him. And so Jesus was walking this very fine political tightrope of trying to empower his followers and at the same time be very clear with them, and yet while at the same time not offending the religious leaders too boldly yet, because he didn't want to accelerate the time frame of what his life was ultimately going to lead to, which was death and then resurrection. And so he's always trying to kind of subversively put truth in front of these two groups of people, his followers and also the people who were his enemies. And in this particular example, he's trying to do both. And he says, hey, there's something I want you guys to know, that there is a way of thinking about this idea called sheep. And sheep are actually reflective of what I want you to know about how you lead people and how you relate to other people. And so he says this example where he says that there's a shepherd and the sheep won't follow the shepherd because they don't know his voice. And what would typically happen, and one of the ways I think about this is during the life and times of Jesus in the ancient Near East, there would be lots of situations where shepherds would enter into a town or a city or even just a small gathering, and they would have to store their sheep somewhere. I mean, think of it some way as like parking your car. And so they didn't have individual pens built for individual shepherds. It's not like Shepherd Bob had his own pen at 7 different cities and Shepherd Joe had his own pen as well. There would just kind of be one big generic pen outside the city. And so the shepherds would come and just dump their sheep in there for the night, and they would go in and they would talk and they would buy supplies and they would sleep and they would eat. And then in the morning they would come back out and they would be responsible for finding their sheep. Well, how do you find your sheep? You know, there's certainly ways like we just saw in the video where you can mark them and you can know them, but there was also a more subtle way. And this is what I believe Jesus is alluding to, is that as a shepherd would spend time with sheep, he would sing and talk and cajole and kind of encourage and admonish his sheep, and that would be primarily through verbal words. And so as he expressed his verbal words to his sheep, the sheep would learn the voice of their respective shepherds. And so they would follow that voice. They would learn the mannerisms. They would hear the intonation. They would learn the certain kind of songs. They would learn all of those things. And so when the shepherd would come out in the morning or afternoon or whenever it was that they were getting their sheep, instead of going out and kind of handpicking each one and grabbing them by the collar, they would just start to sing, or they would start to talk or whistle or use some of their words. And the sheep that had walked with them for a really long time, who were familiar with that voice, they would come out naturally. And the sheep who did not know their shepherd's voice that was singing, they would stay in there and wait for the voice that they recognized. This is what Jesus is talking about here. When he says that the doorkeeper opens and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. But they will by no means follow a stranger. They will flee from him, because they do not know the voice of strangers. Well, Jesus takes this idea of relationship between a shepherd and a sheep one step further, and we see this a few verses down in verse 14. And he says that something about this illustration points to what he's doing with his followers, and he says, I am the good shepherd. I'm not the one that I was talking about before. I'm not the one who comes in and tries to steal or kill or destroy. I'm not the one who tries to steal sheep who aren't my own. I'm not the one who tries to take things that don't belong to me. And that's not what I'm even doing now. And so he's kind of jabbing at the Pharisees, right? And he's saying, listen, all of the work that I'm doing and all of the religious influence that I have and all of these lives that are following me, it's not like I'm doing this in an illegitimate way. These are my sheep. And he identifies that by verse 14. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known by my sheep. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father. And some other translations say, just as the Father knows me. So I know my sheep, and I'm in relationship with them, and I'm creating influence with them, just as my heavenly Father, the God the Pharisees, who you say that you're worshiping, just as he and I know each other and share influence, I'm doing the same thing with all of the people that I'm doing here. Now, what's the word that shows up several times in this passage besides sheep? No. No, we come over and over and over again. And what I think Jesus is doing is he's saying that if you're an authority over someone, if you're responsible for someone else, you are called deeply to know who they are. A shepherd was called to know his sheep, and Jesus is saying, I'm called to know the people that I'm responsible for having authority over, that I'm influencing. I need to know them deeply. So how do we know the people that we're influencing? How do we know the people that we're responsible for deeply? The kind of way that Jesus is pointing to, even in an intimate way where the Father and the Son, that he and God himself know each other. How do we do that in our own lives? Well, there was a book written by a man decades ago called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. And how many of you guys are familiar with Psalm 23? Even just a little bit. Yeah. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures, and so it goes on. And so what this author did is he actually was a shepherd, and he spent a lot of time shepherding sheep in Africa, and so he decided to write a book about what are the parallels between real-life shepherding and what Psalm 23, one of the most famous passages of the Christian Scriptures, what do those have in common? And one of the things that he said is that a shepherd was absolutely responsible for knowing the terrain and the track of movement that the sheep are going through. So it wasn't just enough for the shepherd to know who the sheep were and how they were, and it wasn't even enough for him to count them, but he had to know a vast amount of information beyond just his sheep. He had to know which grass was okay to eat. He had to know where you could find water at certain times of year. He had to know where there would be predators coming through. He had to know all kinds of things about the lay of the land. And I think one of the ways that we can know the people that we're responsible for and the way that we can exercise the authority that God has given us is that we make a very strong and continued effort to know the big picture of what's going on. To know the world that the people that we are leading are inhabiting. To be aware of those things. And there were two great examples of that in the news this past week, and I want to just talk to you about them. One of them has to do with the new, well, relatively new CEO of GE, Jeffrey Immelt. And I don't know if you've been following the news about that, but GE was a huge company, and it was led by a man named Jack Welch, who was one of the most famous CEOs in the 20th century. He built GE into being a huge conglomerate of businesses. He was fantastically successful and had a very strong reputation of not just being a shrewd business leader, but also just a good leader in general and just a very big personality. Well, how do you follow that, right? How do you take over a company that has grown in 20 years, leaps and bounds, and accomplished so much? Well, Jeffrey Immelt was responsible for that. He is responsible for that. And so he's been answering a couple questions lately because GE is making some decisions to kind of shed some of the things that Jack Welch, his predecessor, had worked so hard to build. And so he's kind of having to answer questions and explain why that's happening. And one of the ways that he describes it is this. And he's talking about leading change. And he says, the trick of following someone like a Jack Welch, the trick of following a CEO who's been so successful, and my role is I have to be able to talk about the past without ever hinting that anything was ever wrong with the past. And yet consistently push us forward towards change. Meaning that he has this weird balance of saying, I have to somehow lead this organization forward and make difficult decisions. And yet I can't ever insinuate that the way that my predecessor, Jack Welch, did was anything ever wrong, because he's such a big force in the world still. And he has such a notoriety of success in the public and within GE. Now, that shows some pretty wise leadership on Mr. Immelt's part. And he is not just aware of who his VPs are, not just aware of the shareholders, and not just aware of his direct reports, but he's aware of a broader culture that's in place in the things that he's responsible for. And he says something about that is important for him to pay attention to. Another example, maybe less dramatic, there's an e-processing payment that processes credit cards out in Seattle called Gravity Payments. And the CEO started his company when he was a college student, and it's grown. They've done very, very well in the years since, and he still is relatively young, and so he started to think about what was next for his company. And he began to talk with several of his friends and even some of his employees, and these were people that were making considerably less than him. And as he began to ask about what life was like, he realized that, if someone made $40,000 or even $50,000, that was not a tremendous amount of money. And most of these people were saddled by student loans, and they were kind of one emergency away from having really significant financial difficulties in their life. And so he began to reflect on that, and he said, man, I don't know if $40,000 is enough. And so he just announced this past week that within the next 2 years, he's transitioning his company to have the minimum wage, so that the lowest salary for an employee in his payroll is going to be $70,000, right? And people, started shouting and were hollering. I think some people even blacked out. I mean, they were just really excited about this. I put in an application. I mean, that's really... And the reason, I'm kidding, the reason why he said he did that is because he wanted people to have a better life. And 70,000 was kind of the threshold of the number that, and you can read this for yourself. Several studies have said that if you make any more money beyond 70 or, $75,000, your ratio of happiness starts to actually decline, right? So $70,000 for whatever reason in America seems to be kind of the golden average of what you need to make in order to find happiness. So he said, okay, we're going to do that. And so he's taking a significant pay cut. He's cutting other executives' pay cuts. And his hope is that this will increase morale to the point that his business will grow and he'll be able to restore his executive's salary, including his own. But for now, he said the line in the sand is $70,000. Now, he didn't have to interview every single employee. He didn't have to pay deep attention to maybe even the receptionist or his, office manager or anything like that. He just started talking, and he started to learn what it was like to be involved with the bigger picture of his world that he was responsible for, right? And he made a decision because of that, and his leadership is growing because of that. Now, you may not be the CEO of a company like GE, and in fact, you may not even be in the position to give someone a $70,000 minimum wage, but you do have people that you are responsible for. You might have children. You might have neighbors. You might have a neighborhood. You might have employees. You might have a volunteer team at a church. You might have a school board. You might have a soccer team for your kids. I mean, you might have all of these things you're responsible for. And one of the ways that you can grow in your leadership and use your leadership and influence effectively is if you begin to see your responsibility as extending to understanding the big picture of what the world really looks like for the people that you're leading, right? You have to know these big pictures. So for me, that means it's important for me to know the family history of my wife. It's not enough to know that she was born outside of D.C. It's not enough to know that she went down to Florida to visit her grandparents. It's not enough to know that her mom lives in Denver right now. I want to know what they did for Christmas. I want to know how they exchanged gifts. I want to know what was hard. I want to know what they did to celebrate. I want to know the family history of my spouse because in a very real way, I influence her and she influences me and I'm responsible for her. It means that when I'm driving my daughter home from school, I don't just ask her, how was school? I want to know what she did. I want to know if she got to see the little lizard Speedy. I want to know if she had any conversations with her little girlfriends. I want to know if the teacher talked to her about anything significant. I want to know because I want to enter into my daughter's world, and I want to understand so I can have a greater influence and leadership in her life, right? Even in my own world right now, I'm responsible for people, and I have direct reports too, and so I need to know the lay of their land. Because it's part of how I exercise influence and leadership over them. Know the big picture. It's really important, and this would have been absolutely essential to this idea of shepherding. The other idea that Jesus moves to, in this idea of shepherding, we see in this same book, A Shepherd Looked at Psalm 23, that it's not enough just to know the lay of the land and the grass and the water and all that stuff, but each shepherd was responsible intimately for the welfare and condition of his sheep. And so he would know if a sheep was lame. He would know if a sheep had a skin condition. He would know if they were wrestling with some type of stomach issue. He would know the condition of every single individual sheep. And so it's this big picture that we're called to know, and yet it's also this small picture, this intimate knowledge of the people that we are responsible for, right? Let me give you another example from the home. I heard a pastor say one time that, hey, there's a lot of understandings about marriage out there, and if you're not careful, you're going to read some marriage book, and the marriage book is going to say men need to understand women in general, right? And he says that might be helpful to a certain extent, but the really profound thing that you need to be aware of if you're married, and the thing that you're called to, is that you're not called to be an expert in women. You're called to be an expert in one woman. You're not called to understand all of men, thank God. You are called to understand one man, your husband. And what he was doing is he was narrowing this down, and he's saying there are certain principles that are helpful for marriage, and yet ultimately you're responsible for managing your relationship and helping that relationship be as good as possible with one person solely. And you've got to become an expert in him or her. Now, extend that out to maybe for those of us that have corporate responsibilities. It might be impossible for us to know every single employee. And some of you are probably involved in really large companies. Even, a team of 18, 20, 30. You're not going to be able to know every single employee. And yet what you can do is you can make an effort, whoever your direct reports are, you can make an effort to deeply be aware of what's going on in their lives. To push yourself into their circles and to say, man, I don't just want to know what this person can produce for me. I don't want to just know how this person can help further our bottom line and reach our objectives. I want to know who this person really is. I remember one time when my first role actually as a pastor at a church, and I was, a little peon role. I was, small potatoes, and yet my boss had given me something, pretty significant to do, and so I had managed that well, hopefully, and we had succeeded. And afterwards, I got a handwritten thank you card from him with a gift card to go have a nice dinner because he knew that I, enjoyed eating out. And he said, "Hey, you did a great job," and he just specifically affirmed my leadership and said, "This is where you did well. This is what you did. I'm so proud of you for this. I want you to go, and you and Ashley just go and celebrate and have a great dinner on me." Right? He didn't just say, "Hey, good job," but he actually took the time to know that I would actually enjoy steak. He took the time to know that I would actually respond well to specific encouragement, and he did that. This is the kind of leadership where you know your sheep, even as the Father knows the Son. So these are the two ideas I think I want you to hear, is that if you're going to exercise your influence and authority in powerful ways, you need to be aware of the big picture of what's going on, but you also need to be aware of the small picture. But can I give you some really bad news? Even if you do all of that, it's still not enough. It's still not going to be enough to be a good leader. And let me show you what I'm talking about. Jesus continues on. And after he says, "I'm the good shepherd," verse 14, "and I know my sheep and I am known by my own," verse 15, "As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father." Now listen to this. "And I lay down my life for the sheep." We see this all throughout the Bible. That whenever there's leadership and responsibility and influence, it's been given to someone else. It's not just a call to have knowledge. It's not just a call to have understanding. It's knowledge plus sacrifice equals meaningful leadership. Knowledge plus sacrifice equals meaningful leadership. There was a book written several years ago called Every Good Endeavor, and it was written by a man named Tim Keller, who is a pastor in Manhattan at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and he's a prolific author, a very well-respected speaker and thinker. And in that book, he shares this example. He says that there was a young woman who was coming to his church, and he noticed that she would kind of come in and leave pretty quickly and then come back in and leave quickly again. And so finally one day he stopped her and he said, "Hey, my name's Tim. I'm the pastor here. How did you end up at Redeemer? Why are you coming to this church?" And she said, "Well, I just need to tell you this story." She said, "Several months ago, I was involved at my job, and I'm responsible for certain things, and I realized that I had made a pretty significant mistake. The kind of mistake that would cost me my job. And I was deeply nervous about that and wasn't sure how that was going to unfold, and I just didn't know how I was going to ever overcome this. And so I went and told my boss, and then my boss did something that completely surprised me. He went to his superiors, and he took all of the blame for my mistake. And she was completely baffled by this. And so she went into her boss's office and she said, "Why would you ever do this? In my world, and I'm used to this, where my bosses take all the credit for all the things I've done right, and whenever they do something wrong, they pass on all the blame to me. But I've never been in a situation where my boss actually took the blame for something I did wrong." And initially he just kind of said, "Well, it wasn't that big of a deal. I hope it helped you well. Just learn from it and move on." And she kept pressing him, and she said, "No, really, I've got to understand, why did you do this?" And finally he realized he wasn't going to get out of explaining it, so he said this. He said, "Here's the deal. I'm a Christian. And at the core of who I am, I believe that someone else has taken the blame for all of my mistakes when I deserved it. So now and when I can do that same thing for others, it's my privilege to do so." She was so moved by that example of not just knowledge, but sacrifice, that she previously was unconnected to a church, and she started to explore her Christian faith because she said, "Man, if this person would do that for me, I at least have to understand where he's coming from, and maybe that's important to me." This is what the Bible is talking about. This is what good leadership consists of. And parents, this, right? This is why you get up at 3:30 in the morning and hold your daughter's hand. This is why you get up at 4:30 in the morning and put your son back to sleep. This is why you take smaller vacations so you can put money into a college account. This is why you make these sacrifices, because you know that inevitably good leadership and the things that you are responsible for don't just require knowledge, they require sacrifice. And all the people that God has put under us in authority need that same level of commitment and leadership from us as well. Now, this is really hard, right? It's hard to put someone else ahead of yourself consistently. It's hard to lay down your life for people. And I don't know if you caught this, but sheep was not a term of affection. So when Jesus says a shepherd lays down for his life for the sheep, he's essentially saying the good shepherd will sacrifice himself for people who are small-brained and mess up a lot. This is exactly what Jesus does for you and me. And the good shepherd that we all need is the person who lays down his life and says, "You are small-brained, you are wanderers, you are sheep, you are incapable of nearly everything. And yet, I will joyfully sacrifice my life for you so that you can have all the benefits of what it means to be in relationship with my Father." When we begin to understand that and when we begin to connect to the good shepherd that every single one of us needs, then this type of sacrificial leadership becomes easier for us as we are over people and we manage our influence. Because we know who we are, we know what we've been given, and we feel the burden, just like the CEO that Tim Keller talks about, to do the same for others. This is what it means to exercise biblical authority in leadership. Now, I know that most of us need help with this. And so what I'd like to do is I would like to pray and ask God to help us even now as we think about some of these things. Would you pray with me? Gracious Father, thank you for giving us just the chance to be here this morning and hear your truth. God, thank you that you've given us these principles of how a shepherd relates to sheep, and as we are responsible for other people in our lives, whether it be our kids or maybe coworkers or neighbors or team members or anything, God, I pray that we would be mindful of what that actually looks like. And I pray that we would put our eyes on the big picture and understand the world that the people we're responsible for are living within. I pray that we would take the steps to know our people intimately and to get involved with their lives and to really press in. And yet, more importantly, God, I pray that we would see whatever influence and authority that we have over people as a means to hear this call of sacrifice. And God, we're not going to be able to do that very well unless we start to see how much you've sacrificed for us through Jesus Christ. So help us to see that even now. We're grateful for you. Help us to love you more. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray these things. Amen.